Welcome, dear viewers, to a new episode of Dialogue Horizon. As we promised last week, that in this episode we'll go and continue on the discussion about the economic reform, which after our last episode, our guests also anticipated that it is a must to do something about the rate, the national currency rate, and that's exactly what was done. What some people they call it floating, some people they call it, they have different names for it, but we will go in depth. I will discuss this in the episode. So that's why we are I'm very happy and too glad to host a gentleman who is specialized and his PhD in finance, Dr. Abdul Halim Isa Tayman, economist, and his PhD on the finance, which is the subject of our episode, or the subject of the current situation in the country. Also, we have our economist and business development management, Abdul Rahim Jamal Sabra, who in last episode who anticipated, and he said that the only way out is to start by floating the pound rate. So we hope this episode will cover as much as we can. We have a limited time, but we'll do our best to cover as much as we can. First, we'll start with our guest. The first time to receive him in this episode, Dr. Abdul Halim Isa Tayman. He's the economist. Welcome to have you with us in this episode, and we want to know, and maybe the viewers, most of the viewers, will want to know something about the terminology of floating the currency. It has different meanings, and it has different interpretations. It has different. So can you tell us first, before we go in depth on the episode, about this term, this floating? What's the meaning of floating, and what happened in Sudan this week? Is it the floating which is intended or asked by the recipe of the IMF and the World Bank? Or so can you tell us on this issue of floating the currency?
Thank you for having me. And first of all, as we know, the government has decided to adopt the managed flexible exchange rate system. But before we illustrate that, we first must show that or tell that there are three types of exchange rate policies. The first one is the fixed exchange rate system, whereby the central bank sets an official exchange rate. And the second type is the managed flexible exchange rate. And the third one is the free floating exchange rate. The free floating exchange rate, the government or the central bank does not interfere.
Can you give us just an example of countries adopting each of the system? For example, the fixed rate, like countries like
fixed rate, for example, Saudi Arabia,
okay,
United Arab Emirates, and China. For years, it was working with the fixed exchange rate system.
So it's a rich countries.
It's not necessarily, but countries that can defend their currencies by the reserves that are available in the central bank.
Okay.
But for the free floating, this is the case where there is a good, strong economy, whereby any problems that happens, the economy can restore its situation. We are talking about countries like Canada, United Kingdom. These are countries that are working with free floating exchange rate, where the value of the currency is determined by forces of supply and demand in the market. Let's return to the case of Sudan and the recent decision. Here, the central bank sets a limit, and this limit or the currency is allowed to move in this limit, but it's not permissible to exceed this limit. For example, now currently it's set by 5%. So at any time, if the market forces drive this currency out of this range, the central bank would work through its intervention to restore or to reset this, the price again. So when the currency, for example, appreciates, the central bank will set mechanisms by using their reserves, either buying the local currency or selling dollars so that they can keep the demand and supply so that the currency is in the rate. So, but there are challenges, of course, if the government has no reserves, for example, to intervene each time, and the graph or the trend went, for example, in a developing trend in appreciation, for example, or depreciation. This is really a risk. I hope that the government has sufficient reserves to defend the prices that it
So
declared.
what happened? What the government did last week is not free floating.
Yeah.
You call it managed
Flexible.
flexible.
Yes.
Managed flexible, which is
The currency is set to, allowed to move in a range of 5% up and down.
up and down 5%. Okay, thank you, Dr. Rahim. Abdurrahim, very, do you think that now, Dr. Abdul Halim mentioned that there are three types of floating or monitoring the currency, the national currency of any country. One of it is the free floating, which is like, as he said, like in Canada, or managed floating within range, as he also mentioned. So, first of all, this is the prerequisite of the help or assistance of the IMF and World Bank, in which currency they are talking about, free floating, and other countries. Some countries they also try, like Zimbabwe, like Greece, like some Brazil, where they followed the full recipe of the IMF and bank. It didn't work. So it seems that there are certain precautions which we will discuss later, that maybe Dr. Halim will also tell us that what to make this decision, to make it work perfectly. There are some precautions must be followed. But in your opinion, you have an idea that the IMF, on what type of floating they are talking?
To simplify what Dr. Abdul Halim had said, what we're seeing now is a pegged managed float. We imagine that the government would want to sustain or unify the exchange rate in order to move further down the line to unify all exchange rates currently in Sudan. At the moment, they would probably intervene to reduce volatility that happen in the market throughout the year in order to soft land, let's say, the recipe that they are following from the IMF. I think the IMF and all the international donors have been very clear that in order to receive funds and in order to begin the process of highly indebted poor countries, which relieves debt, there must be a unified exchange rate in order for them to have trust in the market and in order for them to believe that Sudan is somewhat going to repay any further funding they receive as opposed to what has happened in the past. So I imagine that they would want to see, let's say, an equilibrium in the market of exchange rates in Sudan in order to fully qualify, of which first step is what the government is doing now with unifying the financial exchange rate in Sudan.
So still we have to do enough. Still the requirements of the IMF, but they all of them, the European Union, the America, and they all commended this step, and they said it's a very courageous step towards in the right direction. That's what they said, but they did not say, yes, this is exactly what we want. Anyhow,
yes.
What you said now, you explained exactly what
Yes.
they want.
Yes, we believe that the entire recipe includes, first and foremost, a unified exchange rate, and removal of all subsidies. And by unifying exchange rate, you need to make sure that the custom exchange rate, everything is at one rate, unified throughout the country. But I think it's courageous because it's politically dangerous at the moment to make this step. And we've seen, as Dr. Abdul Halim mentioned, that this was initially tried in 2018, and it led to the overthrowing of the current government, because it might lead to drastically a devaluation or extreme market fluctuation in the exchange rate.
Okay, Dr. Halim, having heard Abdul Rahim mention that, you mentioned something about this type of money floating, or whatever you call it. It already had been tried in the 2018, and it didn't work, and it maybe led to the collapse of the whole regime. Can you elaborate on this issue of how it was introduced, implemented, and why did it fail at that time?
Okay.
2018 by, I think Mu'taz Musa was the prime minister.
Thank you. This is a very important question, because we know that the same problems that led the previous government to adopt in 2018 the managed floating exchange,
Yes.
flexible system, were the same macroeconomic imbalances and problems. And we know that the government was obliged to take this decision, because we must ask a question: why this decision? Because we inherited a very chronic and bad economic situation with inflation of 212%, and with total debt of around 60 billion. And now estimates say that it is 72 billion. And also we have poverty around 70% in some regions. We have unemployment rates very high. So, and at the same time, the general deficit is growing, and we have a huge gap between export and export. So these structural distortions must be met by some physical consolidation. Foremost is the exchange rate consolidation, and this is the only option allowed or for the government.
But at that time,
no, now, yes,
the only available option.
Yes, because otherwise you will wait for the collapse. At that time, the situation is a bit different from now. In terms of the macroeconomic analysis, they are similar, but Sudan is now witnessing a new era. Sudan has was able, through its political efforts, was able to remove Sudan from state-sponsored terrorism list to be removed, and this is a huge chance for Sudan. At that time, the government was not courageous enough, as Sasab Rahim mentioned. They were not courageous enough to go in the other reform requirements, basically removal of the subsidies from the energy sector. Now the government is no longer printing money, because subsidies is to a large extent was removed. So the deficit is not growing as in 2018. At the same time, Sudan now, in terms of the exchange rate, since Sudan was delisted from the state-sponsored terrorism countries, so now remittances from expatriates abroad is possible. Banks also can receive and send money. This is not possible at 2018. So now this decision is taken in a bit favorable conditions, but still there are some requirements for this decision to last and to succeed, and that we will come to that in the later.
In the episode, yes, we will come. So you believe that the conditions now for taking such big decision are better than what was in 2018.
Yes.
Maybe this one was done after consultation and definitely after intervention of the coaches. We have coaches now. The government is being coached by the UNITAMs, and definitely the decision is taken from from good premises, unlike that's what was taken on 2018. It was just taken from insufficient premises. That's why it failed completely. But still, we have some hurdles along the road. We'll talk about this to see what should be accompanying this decision. If this decision is left alone, it will definitely lead to nowhere, or it will lead to a catastrophe. But if it is propped or guided by the measures which you are going to discuss or to discuss in this episode, it will work. Okay, Abdul Rahim. Definitely one of the important factors, the propping tools. This question, maybe both of you can answer it. What reforms should be accompanying in the banking system, starting from the central bank down to the other commercial banks, private commercial banks? So, what do you think? What is supposed to be done on this banking system, the official banking system, so that it can attract at least can attract the expatriates reserves? In the first 2-3 days, people were suffering from the bureaucratic and the slow movement of the officials and of the bank, and some claims were raised to the Minister of Finance. Still, banks and officials of banks are not yet qualified to cope with this big decision. I think it's a big question. Both of you should contribute, or you can share the answer.
Yes, first, I think foremost, we talked about financial institutions being compliant or ready to deal with international institutions. I think we mentioned this maybe a year back in one of the episodes, that Sudan has been isolated for quite some time. And this isolation means that we are very far from norms or compliance in terms of dealing with the global economy and the financial institutions. So imagine that most banks would have already begun and underway in making sure that all the compliance measures and all the required, let's say, bureaucratic processes with international corresponding banks are in place. Because just unifying the exchange rate is one step of the way, but we need to be able to efficiently transfer money from here to the UK, to Canada, to the US, and receive. And when we're talking about markets or supply and demand, it usually involves not just remittance, but also import and export of goods. So the banking channel should be now the most enticing channel to use when importing, exporting goods, or exchanging, in order for the economy to actually operate efficiently and to reduce the economic inefficiencies that were present in Sudan. I think Dr. Abdul Halim can talk about the structural reforms required.
What are the expected or supposed? You mentioned in your various introduction that this should be accompanied, if not accompanied, by certain precautions and certain measures in the banking system. The whole thing will collapse, which will lead to probably a big problem. So what is your recommendation on the banking system, from Bank of Sudan to this level of the commercial banks?
Okay, as is the case with any decision, this decision is a huge decision taken in a very critical time in the history of our nation, and it is open to all probabilities. That is why we must talk about the preconditions for the success of the decision.
Okay.
First of all, there must be a full commitment of all Sudanese citizens, parties, and all institutions to back up the decision so that it will go peacefully. The second thing is that we need also some structural reforms, especially in the legal framework, so that the environment will be more attractive for local and international investors. We need also investment laws, and I think the new government has a plan to set the right situation and environment for this decision to succeed. But also we need to continue in the reform, because it is a process, and I think there are some additional reform requirements, especially the public companies, especially those owned by the military. They must be converted to joint stock companies. And without doing that, and without enabling and empowering the private sector to take its role in the coming development, it will also act as a negative. It will play as a pulling factor in this process. So I think the government must give the private sector its role, its basic role. Because countries like Turkey and other economic reform examples, show that the private sector was the driving force and was the leading in the economic reform and development in that time. So I think the private sector in Sudan needs to be enabled to play this role, so that the government must promptly convert these companies into joint stock companies, and the government remains playing its role as a facilitator and as administrator for the economy. And as we know, it is also a decision that impacts the society. So also the impact that will result from this decision on the citizens must be addressed, because we are talking about the probable adverse social results from this decision on the citizens in the prices of basic commodities. So the government must provide or keep the prices stable, for at least for the basic commodities, and this is what the finance minister has declared, that they will do their best, and they are sure that they will not let the prices in the basic commodities to increase. And also the social impact of this decision must be addressed carefully. And we are also witnessing favorable conditions in terms of peace. So now many parts of Sudan are now enjoying peace, and that will contribute in people return to their lands, farms, and they will also engage and get back to work on production, and that will also help in this case if the budgets are directed to agriculture and industry. And also we know that the government or the central bank has decided to stop financing local trade. The budget that's normally finds its way in speculation in the exchange or pressing the exchange rate, because most of this money was used to buy foreign exchange currencies, and they were stored and then later sold. And so by stopping local commerce financing, so a lot of finance will be available for agriculture in the next period.
Okay, that's good. So we are saying that a lot of measures should be taken, starting from the restructuring of the banking system, in boosting the efficiency of the people working on the banking system, creating good relations with international banking system and opening channels. That is very important. But Rahim, if we talk about the direct effect, you have been in the industry, you know the industry and you know the inputs of the industry. Will this decision of this managed floating or float of them, to what extent will it affect the cost of production in regard to the cost of goods, imports of goods, as you know, to what extent
Okay.
will it affect, and how can we go about it? How can we avoid or circumvent any failure on this
Okay.
road?
If we look at one aspect of importing raw material, Sudan or most of industries in Sudan were burdened with the task of having to use a lot of intermediary channels to make payments, which adds on to the cost of acquiring, let's say, raw material or inputs for production, things like this. I think adding 3% of cost, in acquiring raw material in order to use a lot of intermediary channels, eventually translates down to 7% or more in the cost of the final product, which was a burden on the consumer. So now we imagine that being able to deal directly and without sanctions, this should be able to reduce cost of production and allow us to eventually increase production, increase efficiency when it comes to production or imports. So overall, and in the long term, prices of commodities or production should be favorable, as opposed to the recent decades. If we look at another aspect of the exchange rate, a lot of or a big part of the economy is being able to fix the trade imbalance and being able to export just as much as we are importing, and this would also help a lot in bringing back the entire amount or of funds which were received when exporting commodities. We know that the regular practice was part of the amount would come back and a lot of it would stay outside of the country because of the fear of dealing with the financial institutions or the fear of bringing back all of the money to Sudan in instability. But now we imagine that more exporters would be able to have confidence in the economy, have confidence in financial institutions, and this would allow more or all of the amounts which were exported or the value to come back fully to Sudan. So in the first aspect, we look at a better cost reduction or efficiency, and the second aspect, we look at more remittance in terms of exports.
In terms of export?
Yeah.
But the effect of costing the local product at the rate of 300 or 400, whatever. Like, for example, you have been in the refrigerators business now. So it was the costing, your costing was very sensitive to the movement of the dollar rate compared to the Sudanese pound.
Yes.
So the effect will be
favorable.
Will be favorable?
It will be favorable because now, if you could remember, we used to use intermediary and other channels in order to make payments to suppliers.
Yes,
so this adds on to the cost of importing raw material. And like we said, if 3% additional in cost of raw material is added because of the inefficiency in the channel, then it translates down to 7% or more in the cost of finished good, which eventually translates down to the end consumer. So imagine now the financial institutions would allow these transactions to be more efficient or cost less, which means that it will translate at a better cost down the chain until there is a finished product and at a better price to the end consumer.
But the end consumer is buying the product in Sudanese pounds, which is evaluated at 380, let us say. Well, and the income, the people will not change.
Yes, but at the same time, everything in Sudan was priced at the parallel market price. No one was being able to use the 55 SDG official bank rate If you are importing goods, you were already paying that
okay.
equivalence in the black market, because the bank did not supply you with
the money.
with the money.
Okay,
So
that answered my question. Yes,
yeah.
yes, that's very important. I just wanted to make sure that it will not be affected, because already local producers, they are bearing their cost on the black market rate
Of course,
and monitoring it closely.
daily.
So the effect will be favorable, because 3%, at least 3% will be off of the cost, because now you can directly remit money through letter of credit to China, for example, without any third part. Okay, that is very good. Dr. Abdul Halim, what about the dollar rate? Till this moment, the customs dollar is fixed, not changed. Do you think this is something good, or it has to be unified with the managed rate?
Before we come to that,
Yes,
we
sure.
must share the spectators about the results until now, since the decision was
Yes,
taken.
okay, that's very good.
And normally in similar cases, the immediate result normally expected is rising inflation or prices of goods and services. But in our case, until now, we are sure that prices did not move up. And this is one of the major good results of this decision. The other thing is that also the prices, or the gap between the official rate, the rate that the central bank has declared, 376. The next day, the black market rate was 395, so the gap is 19 pounds. But after 4 days, the gap reduced to only 3 pounds,
Which is good indication.
which is also a good indicator. So at the same time, the government is also witnessing another good news, because in the banks also we have seen queues of people rushing to sell their foreign currencies. So to the extent that one of the banks has declared that their budget set for that day has expired, so these are very good news, and to the extent that we expect, as from next week, the banks will be able also to meet the demand of foreign currency for the public. And but returning to your question about the customs rate,
But to enhance your argument, it's very good. Yes, just I remember something now. It is very important, which enhances your argument, that now we can feel that there is awareness, popular awareness. People now are aware of the importance of dealing with the official channels, and sometimes they are trying to boycott completely, even socially, the dollar dealers, because now people, which is something very, very important. It raises the awareness of the ordinary people. That's why, as you mentioned, there are queues, lines in the banks to exchange their money. Okay, go ahead.
yes. And actually, what you mentioned is very important, because unless there is social awareness and commitment of all parties, such decisions cannot be left for the government alone. And we have seen yesterday the Sudanese Business and Employers Federation has declared a huge support for the government by announcing a figure of $1 billion to be deposited in the central bank. And this is yesterday, and this also will have its impact as from Sunday, I expect, in the prices. So such commitments and belief in the decisions and backing of the government are important. Political parties also constituting the current coalition of the government, they are also supporting the government. And the international community as well is standing by Sudan. And as I mentioned, also the government has also declared that remittances of Sudanese abroad expatriates are free from any duties. This is also at the time that it is possible to transfer money from any part of the world to Sudan. All these conditions, favorable conditions and news will contribute, I think, in stabilizing the rate declared by the central bank. And we expect as from next week the central bank will witness the beginning of accumulating reserves in the central bank. But concerning the duties rate, until now, according to the budget of 2021, the rate is still fixed, it's not revised. And I think this is important at this time because when you move or increase this rate, it will impact the poor classes because they normally results in rising prices for the basic commodities, and this is what we are avoiding. One important thing also is that the result of this decision, people were asking about the adverse effects. I think we have three classes, the rich, the middle class, and the poor. The poor, according to the program of the government, they are not probably be hard hit because we have social support programs, direct support programs. For the rich, we know that these are the people now are having the reserves of the hard currency. The middle class needs special treatment, but that's something needs some time to talk about. But later, if we have time, we can talk about the other advantages of this decision.
Okay, that's good, Abdurrahim. Let us assume that if we assume that now the gap is not big, as Dr. Halim mentioned, gap between the parallel market and the official market, the declared market price is not big. It started big, but now it is not widening. It's coming narrower. Just in case if it happens, if there is skyrocketing by big difference, what kind of measures can be taken by the government? Let us assume that for maybe now demand on dollar or the foreign currency is not high, or maybe people are afraid to go in any dealings. So maybe the demand is low. Let's assume that if the demand jumps at any one time, and the gap becomes very wide between the declared rate, the official rate, and the black market rate, which will definitely attract people. If the gap is very big, definitely people will go to the black market again. What kind of measures can be taken by the government to curb this failure of the whole measures? It's very serious and very dangerous. What kind of
as mentioned, the floating is politically dangerous because it could lead to Zimbabwe. It could lead to more hyperinflation and more deterioration, things like this. At this point, I would assume that the government does have the reserves required in order to initially unify the exchange rate as they have done now. And the fluctuation in which you are mentioning is probably the intervention which the government is required to do in order to maintain the minimum rate or the minimum difference between the parallel market until it disappears or there is a equilibrium, because the parallel market exists in reality in Sudan because there is inefficiencies. Demand and supply do not equal each other. So to answer your question, I believe the most important aspect would be that the government should have the necessary reserves in order to intervene in the managed float that they are trying to operate. And down the line, this devaluation of the currency could be done intentionally in order to make Sudanese exports more favorable. We've seen, the European Union devaluated the euro 5 or 6 years back in order to make European Union exports more favorable to the international market and to compete with Japan, China, and the US, and it worked well for them. So, but I think this is a little bit down the line.
Which you think that it is, so from what you are saying, that there should be a sizable reserve, what they call a cushion. Some people, some economists, maybe Dr. Harim will tell us or elaborate on more. Sometimes people, they criticize the decision because they say that the government took the decision without having the necessary cushion to absorb the first shock of this new rate of the pound. Now Abdul Rahim is saying that one of the measures which can be now, if the gap becomes very wide between the parallel market and the official rate, is the intervention of the bank, Central Bank of Sudan, if it has the enough foreign money reserve, they can supply the banks and they can flood the banks at least 1 or 2 days with the foreign currency to meet the demand of the agriculture or inputs or the industrial inputs, so the dollar will go down. So it is important to have this reserve. Do we have this reserve?
This is a very important question because we must ask the question, what is the Sudanese case? Because every economy has its own peculiarity. But we know that in similar cases, as was the case in India in 1991, when the country witnessed a currency crisis, they had good reserves of gold they sold so that they made the reserves, as Ibrahim said. And in Egypt, there is a loan that was attained by Egypt, and it contributed in stabilizing the price of the local currency. In the case of Mexico, in the Mexican peso crisis in 1991, they were able to receive around 64 billion as a loan from US and from the IMF. But in the case of Sudan, this is a very question. This is a very important question. Are there reserves now in the central bank, or are they expecting any loan that will curb an increase or speculative attack for the next time? Because we have speculators. We don't trust them. They may attack the exchange rate at any time. But I think that this is why I think that the government must search for a loan now, because until now the results of the decision is success. But to preserve this success, we must search for a loan. This is one. The other thing is that also, although we have a distortion in the structure of our imports, because 85% of it for basic goods and for raw materials, but still we need to do something on the 15% so that we can just reduce our imports even for 5–6%. Because we know that our currency has depreciated, as Rahim said, and this also allows us to export more cheaper. But any loan that must come must be directed to production. The government must go into austerity measures immediately, and this also helps in closing the deficit gap in the fiscal budget. And these are the things that are required immediately now. So I think that the IMF or any other institutions, especially Sudan, after it went on these measures, reform measures, I'm sure they will be exempted from some of the loans and the debts, I mean, sorry. Because Sudan also can benefit from its rights in HIPEC, for example, agreement, and if they were given some chance, I'm sure they will receive a loan from any other institution, regional or international.
Okay. Okay, but very important matter. Now I remember something which is some people, yes, very enthusiastic, and they say they talk in the media, and they talk about contributing or depositing millions or billions of dollars, and the employers union are pledging 1 billion. From our experience, we had a lot of promises like this. We had a lot in Sudan. When it comes to reality, you will find nothing. So I think one of the important things is that transparency. The government should be very transparent in this matter. Okay, some people now, yesterday or 2 weeks, immediately after the decision, they pledged, and they said that they will deposit in the central bank about 1 billion. One of the businessmen said that he himself will deposit 1 million. 1,000 of these businessmen can make 1 billion. It's not a big issue, but will it come to? Do you think that it's feasible? That we had pledges like this before in different aspects, but it didn't work because people, they did not honor their words.
To answer your question, I think conditions are different now as in the past. We can say on the positive side that the current situation is more favorable than the preceding government. Now there should be trust in Sudan as a nation. There should be trust in Sudan as an economy, internal and external. It's great that there is a lot of pledges, as you said, but in reality, we will all be watching very closely because, you know, economic reform is a progress. It is not something that will happen imminent. It is not something that can be done overnight. I do agree with you that there is not complete transparency, even from the government, on the measures they are taking are based on what confidence they have in reserves, in pledges, in commitments. I don't think this is entirely being shared, at least with the public. Maybe sharing this to a certain extent will build up confidence, as confidence takes time also. It cannot be done overnight. We know that one thing, they keep stating, any official from the government, that this decision was based on the confidence of the current government in having the required resources, regardless if it's foreign exchange, gold, as mentioned, pledges, things like this. So they seem fairly confident. I would imagine that now it would make sense to be transparent about the measures they have taken and the commitments they have received and the funds they have received.
Yeah.
Dr. Yasser already mentioned there's a lot of programs that they would
Halim.
now qualify for. Sorry, Dr. Halim. Such as highly indebted poor countries from the IMF programs, which gives loans and forgives debt, and even international donors will now have more confidence if they can manage the float in an efficient or effective way. Because I don't forget that a month ago, the Minister of Finance at the time, being Dr. Hiba, said that she will try to maintain inflation at 95%. So it's not no inflation or 1 or 2 with the regular, it's at 95%, which we all thought was a bit difficult to do, being that we've seen 300% inflation in the last year.
Okay, Abdurrahim, is it something bad that the government declares that it has so many millions or billions of dollars at the bank right now? Till this moment we are talking, no official, only the social media. This is the social media, 1 billion, 2 billion.
Speculation.
Official document from the governor of the Bank of Sudan saying that now we have a reserve in hand of
For
1
1
billion.
year, for 1 year, for 2.
Is it something secret? Is it secret? Normally, in general, in different countries, Dr. Halim, is it wise? Is it good? Is it something secret? It has to be secret to keep the value of the reserve at the central bank of any country, or it's better to declare it? Which I don't know why officials are not till now not mentioning a figure, exact figure that we have right now in the bank, central bank of Sudan, 1, 2, 3 billion or 500 or half billion. Why till this moment not official document came out of the central bank, because this will definitely, when the central governor, central bank says, now I have 1 billion, definitely the black market will disappear.
Okay. We know that the, uh, the black market is controlled by people who have access to information. And they have developed an institutional network,
Yes.
and they are very tough. And they know everything about the situation of the government. And I think the indicators of this struggle for the last 7 days shows that there is somewhat, anyhow, the speculators, they felt that the government is this time is strong. Otherwise, they should have attacked the exchange rate.
But why the government is not using this muscle? This is a big muscle. It's the right time to use it. Say I have so many billion or 1 billion right now. Why the government is hiding this? Why concealing this? This is very important to stabilize the whole system of the IMF or the floating of the pound. Why the government is not disclosing this? This gives the doubt. It makes you in doubt. Now you are saying something. I agree with you. Those they have cartels, very efficient cartels, the dollar dealers and black market dealers. They know exactly what is happening. That's why till this moment the gap between the black market is not big, but it might be a tactical decision from these people. These people are very dangerous and very clever.
Yes.
They could be hiding something, or they want
Yes.
to make a surprise, and maybe something political. We have to put in mind that some forces against the revolution, they might intervene, they might do something to offset the whole thing.
This is correct. I agree with you that normally with such decisions there's a moral obligation that you must talk to people and tell them what exactly the effects will be on their lives.
Yeah.
And but also this returns us to the same question: why did the government took this decision? And it knows that it was surrounded, was a lot of risk. Some forces are calling for protests against the government, and the government also is just working turbulent environment. I think one of the most important things that the government, maybe it has a trust that the people will are aware of the need for such a decision. But still there is a need for the government to come out and talk to people, not only to declare about the results, but on daily basis they must come and talk about the developments of this decision.
It will help.
Yeah, I see.
Okay, that is very good. Okay, Abdulrahim, that's one of the last questions. I think we are running short of time, but anyhow, the director of the IMF or some countries, European countries, the EU, European Union, and America, they all immediately commended and they appreciated this step of the government. They're calling it as something courageous. What does this mean? Is this something, I think something good, but
Yes.
can you elaborate on what is after this commendation or after this appreciation of the courageous decision? Because as you said, politically it is a problem.
Okay. It is also apparent, I think, that as you said, the government is using the support from a lot of current friends, such as the EU, the US, and the World Bank and IMF, in order to develop a strategy for reform. Their commendation on this step means that they fully support, or they were part of the decision that the government has made in order to reach economic reform. If we look at institutional requirements, like the IMF, World Bank, we can see that it requires Sudan to unify exchange rate, to lift subsidies, in order for it to be compliant and to meet the requirements to receive loans or development funds, and even the MOU signed by the former Secretary for Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin of the U.S., lays out the plan and a requirement for Sudan by initially unifying the exchange rate in order for it also to receive support from the U.S. Department of Treasury. So I imagine that this quick commendation or support means that a lot of these nations were actually behind the plan which led to the decision.
This is something good. Okay, my last question to, very important question, I think, to Dr. Halim, about the, we heard you were talking about some, you call it the gray companies, or you are always talking or advocating that in order for such a big plan, free market, the private sector should be given some leverage over the public sector. Can you tell us something about this partnership between the government and the private sector, not the gray companies?
I think one of the most important things that the development, the forthcoming development, should be private sector-led growth. And this is the case where many nations have succeeded in their economic reform measures, especially in Turkey, for example. The private sector, because it was given its essential and basic and normal role. And through the private public partnership, stories of success tell us that this is a basic or the needed type of relationship at this time. Concerning the gray companies, of course, we know that the private sector is better than the government because it is more elastic, it can create jobs, and this is the case in many countries. I don't think that one of the most distortions that prevailed during the previous regime was the control of the government in investment and economic activities. This must end immediately.
This might end.
And these companies must be converted into joint stock companies. And I'm sure the private sector, unless it plays its basic role, these reforms, for sure, they will be hindered with a lot of obstacles.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this clarification, elaboration, and the episode. It went very fast because the issues are very hot and quick. So thank you, dear viewers, for being with us in the last 55 minutes, talking about this economic situation in the country. We hope next week we'll continue on the same issue after we receive some feedback from the market, the parallel black market, what is the situation. We need to discuss it again, discuss the outcome of next week performance. Thank you, dear viewers, for being with us in the this episode. Hope to see you next week on a new episode. Thank you. Bye.